Welcome to 2 half days of Zoom seminars on the Stormwater Management Manual for Eastern Washington. I'm Doug Howie with the Department of Ecology. I'm the Eastern Washington engineer, I guess you could say. I'm located at headquarters with the rest of the water quality engineers. We work on both manuals, the Western Washington and the Eastern Washington manual. We are support for the permit managers, engineering support for the permit managers, and we all work on grants. But today we're going to talk about the Stormwater Management Manual for Eastern Washington and the Eastern Washington Phase 2 permit and how those work together. I'm going to cover the regulatory aspects of the permit and the manual and what the regulations talk about. Brian Morgenroth was going to, from the city of Walla Walla, will follow me, and he will talk about his experience in reviewing stormwater site plans, submittals that have been turned into the city of Walla Walla. And he's going to talk about Walla Walla's procedures today. Again, I'm starting out by talking about the regulatory perspective of the permits. And so how do we deal with stormwater in Washington State? There are 2 tracks that deal with stormwater in Washington State. One is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Stormwater Permit Program. That's the Phase 2 Eastern Washington General Stormwater Municipal Permit that gets updated every 5 years. We just finished an update in 2019. We updated the Eastern Washington Manual at the same time. It had been in place since 2004. So 15 years seemed to be an adequate amount of time to have one manual in place. And we just updated that in 2019. And according to the timelines in the permit, all the jurisdictions on the east side of the state should be utilizing the 2019 Stormwater Management Manual for Eastern Washington, or their own version that is considered to be equivalent to the Eastern Washington Manual. The other way stormwater is managed in Washington State is through the Underground Injection Control Program, UIC program. This is a WAC, a Washington Administrative Code, that governs the delivery of stormwater, Class 5 UIC stormwater into groundwaters of the state. And jurisdictions can be authorized to discharge water from their MS4, or people who own properties can be authorized, or jurisdictions can be authorized to discharge water to the ground through UICs by going through the UIC program. Both programs have a set of criteria for determining how to provide treatment prior to discharging water to waters of the state, or groundwaters of the state. And they all both have requirements for maintenance and source controls and other specific elements of how to operate their systems. Now, I'm not going to talk about the maintenance issues today and those kind of issues that come into play. I'm just going to talk about how UICs and the municipal permit interrelate in terms of new and redevelopment, which is what we're working on today. So these programs overlap, as you can clearly tell. They both deal with stormwater. The UIC program, specifically when it was written in 2006, worked with the idea that they didn't need to define ACART. The Washington State needs to make sure that anyone that is discharging waters, surface waters or groundwaters of the state, meet the ACART requirements. And the UIC rule said, okay, we will consider you meeting ACART requirements if you use the BMPs that are included in the stormwater management manuals for Eastern Washington and Western Washington. And so the design, construction, and operation of those BMPs are needed. You have to follow those requirements if you're going to follow the UIC rule just as much as if you follow the permit. And so the UIC program borrows that information. So the design criteria that's in the manual, if you're going to be installing a swale prior to discharging water into a dry well, to UIC dry well, you need to design that swale in accordance with the design criteria that's in the manual for designing swales. So out of the permit, section S2A, the Municipal Stormwater General Permit, this language is in all three of our permits, our ecology permits, the phase 1 permit that controls Seattle, Tacoma, Pierce County, King County, Snohomish County, and Clark County on the west side of the state, and the phase 2 permits for the west side of the state and the east side of the state has this identical language. So the permit authorizes discharge of stormwater to surface waters and to groundwaters of the state from MS4s owned or operated by each permittee. So this permit authorizes discharge to the waters of the state. It allows a permittee to let water go out of its piped controlled system into a stream or a lake without any chance of getting in trouble for doing that, as long as they're following the other things that the permit requires them to do. But in the very next section of the permits, in S2A1, the municipal stormwater permits, they take something back. In the first one, they say we authorize discharges to surface waters and groundwaters. But in S2A1, they say that discharges to groundwaters of the state through facilities regulated under the Underground Injection Control Program, defined in Chapter 173-218 WAC, are not authorized under the permit. So if a jurisdiction is discharging waters to groundwaters of the state through a dry well, which is covered under the UIC rules, then you need to get authorization for that discharge from the UIC coordinator. And you get that authorization by registering that UIC with the Department of Ecology. Now, the Department of Ecology had in the past had one person responsible for UICs statewide, Mary Shalene Hansen. She has since retired. I believe she retired in January. We had troubles finding a replacement for her. And so she came back for a short period of time after January to kind of catch up on what the backlog. But we have since hired a new UIC lead, Eugene Radcliffe, who has been on board for a little bit more than a month now. And he is now the lead for UICs. He's the only UIC person in the state. So he covers both Eastern and Western Washington, but he's has moved from one Department of Ecology to another one, and he's been familiar with UICs for quite some time. So we do have a person that's very familiar with UICs. Now, when do you follow the UIC rule, and when do you follow the permit? Well, if you're discharging to the surface, if they're discharged from the new and redeveloped property, or any other project is discharging to surface waters, then you automatically follow the permit. You follow the requirements of the permit. If you are discharging to non-UICs for infiltration purposes, such as an infiltration pond. An infiltration pond is not a UIC. And so if you're using that for infiltration purposes, then you're still following the permit, because you're not discharging to the ground through a UIC, you're discharging to the ground through a infiltration BMP. But now what happens if you're discharging to the ground through a dry well or a infiltration trench that has a perforated pipe in it, or through storm chambers that are designed to be used for filtration. All of those are defined as UICs. So what happens if you're discharging to those? Well, not in the permit, but in the Stormwater Management Manual for Eastern Washington, in section 20.1, we have this text. For all project sites that discharge all stormwater runoff to a class 5 underground injection control well, none of the 8 core elements apply, since UIC wells are not covered under the municipal stormwater permit. However, the proponent still needs to provide a stormwater site plan, implement construction stormwater pollution prevention best management practices, and need to apply source controls. So what are those last 3? Stormwater site plan is core element number 1, essentially. Implement construction stormwater pollution prevention best management practices is core element number 2, and apply source controls is core element number 3. So even if you are discharging all the water, there's no water running off this project site into the MS4, the proponent still needs to submit something to the jurisdiction, stormwater site plan to the jurisdiction, so the jurisdiction knows what's going with how they're dealing with stormwater at that site. Implement the construction stormwater best management practices. If you had a more than 1 acre site, you have to get a ecology permit, construction permit. If you're under 1 acre, then the local jurisdiction is going to be checking on your process. And if you're a commercial or industrial project, you'll need to apply source controls, core element number 3. And the key word in the start of this is if you're discharging all stormwater runoff to a UIC well. In Western Washington, we are defining all stormwater runoff as indeed all stormwater. So we run the WWHM extended period simulation in Western Washington, and we require, if you're going to follow the UIC rule instead of the permit, you have to have all the water that runs off the site in that WWHM analysis. That has to all stay on the site. You cannot discharge any off the site into the MS4. If any goes into the MS4, you're no longer covered by the UIC rule. You are covered under the permit. So what are we saying for Eastern Washington, which is what you're probably interested in? So what we're saying for Eastern Washington of what constitutes no discharge to the MS4, we are saying the 100-year 3-hour storm. You need to look at both the 100-year 3-hour storm and the 100-year 72-hour storm. And whichever one of those is larger, has a larger volume, we're defining that, ecology is defining that as all. Now, that is not written anywhere at the moment. That is, right now, that is ecology's interpretation. We have not put that into the manual. It is not into the permit at this point in time. I believe, I'm not speaking out of turn here, but I believe that we are considering putting this into the manual as a recommendation for the distinction between when you are using when you are following the core elements and when you are following the UIC rule. Now, as an example here, if we are using this no discharge to MS4, being the 100-year 3-hour and the 100-year 72-hour storm, and a system is designed to handle the 50-year storm. Actually, let's even talk about the smaller. If you're designed to handle a 25-year storm, the 25-year storm is the flow control, the large storm event for flow control for Eastern Washington. So you need to Eastern Washington, if you're following core element number 6, flow control, and you're discharging to surface waters, you need to make sure that the discharge post-development is less than half the 2-year storm pre-development and is less than the 25-year storm pre-development. We don't ask you to control beyond the 25-year storm. So if you're doing flow control on a project to the 25-year storm and you're using dry wells or other UICs to infiltrate that runoff up to the 25-year storm, and you now have a 50-year storm which overflows the dry well and discharges to the MS4, you now are covered under the permit, and your design needed to be done under the permit following the core elements. So if there's a potential, if you're designing things for storm sizes that could result in a discharge to the MS4, you need to follow the permit requirements, the core elements, to design your BMPs, both treatment and flow control. And you do not follow the UIC regulations. The key difference between the UIC regulations and the permit regulations are how you determine the treatment before you put water into the UIC. If you are following the UIC rule, you follow the matrices that identify how to do treatment. And I will talk about those towards the end of my talk. If you are following the permit, you need to follow core element 5 and core element 6 to determine treatment and flow control. Those are the two different ways to do it. You still need to do core element 1, you still need to do core element 2, and you still need to do core element 3, no matter which way you go. If you are infiltrating 100% on site, you don't have to worry about flow control because you've taken care of flow control already. So core element number 6 doesn't come into play. Core element 8 may come into play, the local jurisdiction's requirements. But the key difference between following the permit and following the UIC rule has to do with how you determine treatment.